think we should speak from here.
You're going to speak from here, right?
Is that okay?
Okay, yeah. Are we all going to speak from here, not there?
And Wolfgang next, and you at that end. Yeah, Wolfgang here.
From here.
Are we speaking from here, not from the lectern?
Yeah, that's fine. We can all do that.
Otherwise, we've got to struggle past each other. Or do these microphones not work?
They work. There's a controller who should, in principle, turn them on for each of us when it becomes our turn.
Are you going to speak from the lectern?
Right from here.
From here.
The second speaker.
Yeah, I'm the second speaker. But he says something to welcome everyone.
Right. Then I get the floor.
And then you?
And you.
Are we going to start? Start?
He has to start.
Oh, he has to start. You're going to start?
Okay. Colleagues, may I call us to order? We'll find out if I have a microphone working. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Society for the Advancement of Socioeconomics. I'm Craig Calhoun, the director of the LSE, and in that capacity, I'm pleased to welcome you all. And because we're starting late and time is limited, I'm going to say no more than how great it is for the LSE to have SASE here, how much I look forward to the discussion, and how happy I am to turn over the microphone to the founder and, in many ways, the sort of, well, do we have saints? Patron saint of SASE, Amitai Etzioni.
Well, thank you very much. We are all... We are all indebted to you for allowing us to have this meeting in your fabulous home. Just when we tell people that we met at LSE, that immediately adds to our cachet and to our standing. So thanks much. I have extremely detailed orders how to spend the next 54 minutes. There are about 16 speakers and 17 comments and such, and so I'll rush ahead. And the only thing I'll say about myself, I was the first member of SASE, so that's all we need to say about that subject. I would argue that capitalism faces an additional challenge of a great magnitude, which will not survive, in my judgment, in addition to those often discussed, not instead, but in addition, inequality and the breaking of the social contract. And I'll say it in 3 sentences that give a few very short examples. They be facing a new industrial revolution in which computers will destroy many middle-class jobs, including in medicine and in education. Just to give a very short example, anesthesiology is something a computer would love. The computer doesn't mind checking every split second about all the dials, if they're in the right numbers. It doesn't get bored. It doesn't read a magazine. It doesn't go to the bathroom. It doesn't consume alcohol. There are many jobs, especially recently in lawyering, are taken over by the computer, number one. Number two, unlike earlier industrial revolutions, it does not generate new jobs in any way in similar number to the jobs it destroys. That's an important detail. Even those of you who live in ultimate sin and believe in neoclassical economics should know that even neoclassical economists don't argue there's an invisible hand, which every time you destroy 100 jobs here, you create 100 new ones. That happened previously, This time, there's very little evidence that it's taking place. Example, when Kodak closed its last plant, just one of its last plants, it fired 45,000 people. Instagram, which provides many of the same services, hired at the time 130 people. So if you just look specifically at jobs being destroyed, for instance, by tapes, which capture lectures, and the new jobs created in making them, you see the disparity. Third and last, the result of the destruction of labor, of jobs, which is the major source of identity for people in capitalist systems. And after all, it's correctly called the legitimacy of affluence. If you look at China and Vietnam, you see that any stories that there's an intrinsic connection between capitalism and democracy is obviously not the case. They have capitalism, they don't have democracy. What they do have, they justify themselves by able to provide people with an ever more affluent way of life. When instead we're going to get massive unemployment. Look at the United States and see it recovering in terms of economic growth, but not in terms of jobs. And so you see the beginning of the process, which ends up with, and that's the last thing in terms of the challenge, we're going to see major social upheaval express itself in one of the reasons of the rise of the right wing, chauvinism, anti-Semitism, anti-immigration. There are many other reasons the population is pushed in that direction, but the destruction of jobs will add significantly. I've been allowed by the organizers later, after all the panelists will have the chance, to tell you my solution. But I just wanted to start with a challenge to get your attention. Now, we're going to hear first from Toynbee. She is the most feared British voice by our security forces.
Is that it? Thank you. Thank you very much. I look forward to seeing my security file if you have it in your pocket. In the history of the last century, I think we've learnt that capitalism just is, like the air we breathe, a living part of human nature, part of what makes us ambitious innovators as a species, reaching out for the new and the better. And an animal is very happy to be exactly the same fox as its forebears were and its cubs always will be, but humans demand never-ending change in pursuit of progress. It's quite wrong to call that impulse animal spirits, because it's a human spirit. And that greed for more and new may be a pretty necessary part of the human condition, but it's only one part of human nature, not even the dominant part, because it's in constant conflict. That drive is in constant conflict with the other part of our character, which is that we are strongly social animals as well. And you might call the two impulses the right wing and the left wing parts of the brain, the pro-social and the pro-capitalist. You do need them both, but you need them to keep them both in balance. And the question is how much capitalism can be saddled and bridled by the social impulse. Left alone, it keeps consuming itself and consuming too many people. So how do we harness its power for the best benefit of most of the people all of the time? After the recent economic cataclysm, the ever more distorting damage done by an under-regulated, rampant capitalism has alarmed even the racehorse owners. The Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, IMF's Christine Lagarde, have recently expressed concern that the greatest threat to capitalism is galloping inequality, breaking the social contract, as Amitai says. The theme of entire World Economic Forum at Davos was the danger that inequality poses to the capitalist system. Who will there be to buy the goods if growing armies of the underpaid and unemployed can no longer afford them, or not without ever-growing household debt, which is now swelling up again, with all of the economic perils that entails? And look at the danger of too much money accumulated in too few hands. What are they going to do with it? What do they do with it? Vast sums of free-flowing capital belonging to humongously rich people looking for somewhere safe to put these billowing gains end up in inflated asset and property prices, risks creating bubbles, knock-on effect with unaffordable housing all the way down the chain. The worry for the Carneys and Lagarde and the Davos folk isn't social, but it's economic. Accelerating bubbles, louder crashes, longer and deeper recessions, each one harder to protect against once debt is already high, interest rates already near zero. And that's how uncontrolled, freebooting capitalism is creating an inequality that may well destroy it. Now, I don't study or write about global inequality. Others here, I'm sure, probably most of you in this room specialize in that. So I'm going to stick to what I know about, which is the United Kingdom. And so I just thought I'd throw out a few random sets of numbers just to give a sense of the texture of what we're talking about, how grotesquely out of kilter wealth and rewards have become in the last 35 years, a time when the bottom 80% have seen their share of national income fall. Look at pay. There are a higher proportion of low-paid workers, that's people earning under two-thirds of the median, in the UK than in any advanced country except the USA. 21% in the UK, 26% in the US, but Switzerland has 9%, Belgium has 6%. Those are capitalist countries, but differently shaped, as are the Nordics, not by accident, but by political and economic choices made over many decades. The 100 richest people in Britain have the same wealth as 19 million of the rest. A third of their wealth is inherited. It would take an average worker 158 years to earn what a FTSE 100 CEO earns in 1 year. It takes a FTSE 100 CEO just 3 days to earn what an average, not a low-paid, an average worker gets in a year. Do they deserve it? Well, if you take FTSE 350 directors, their pay has risen 233% since the year 2000. But their company's market value has risen by just 64%. So it's not performance pay, it's rent that they can take. Government action makes a significant contribution, for better, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. But in changes made in recent years to 2013, in direct cash payments, the top fifth have gained 42%, mainly through pensions tax reliefs, protection of pensioners, and demographically that there are more of them. Meanwhile, the bottom fifth have lost a fifth just in cash benefits. If you look at real standards of living, not the average, but costing the things the poor spend most of their money on versus the rich, much higher proportion of poor incomes go on energy, water, food, less on consumer goods whose prices have often fallen, then the real index, compiled by the New Economics Foundation, shows poorest households have lost 15% since the crash, while the richest 10% have gained 4%. Meanwhile, we're pulling apart from each other as a nation, and I think we feel it. The young are losing out to the old. Regional differences in wealth are much sharper in the UK than anywhere else in Western Europe. Not much about the future looks set to change the trajectory that we're on, or to improve social immobility that sees so many stay more or less where they were born. The gap grows wider, not just in money, but in perceptions and understanding. Those with power and influence controlling most of the levers of opinion know and increasingly care very little about the invisible people beyond their ken. And that's almost everyone outside the top few percent. Their known world has shrunk, and although they may see themselves as global players, they are extraordinarily socially myopic. In our book, Unjust Rewards, which I wrote with David Walker, we conducted focus groups, took a long time to get together, of the very, very rich, people earning up to 10 million a year, financiers, city lawyers, people of that sort. And we gave them each a questionnaire to fill out about what they thought other people earned and where they thought they were on the scale. We got Professor John Hills of this parish to come and tell them the truth and to put up on a board what they'd said compared with what were the actual facts of the matter about distribution of incomes and wealth. They were utterly clueless. They had no idea. They were in the top sort of 0.01%, and they put themselves somewhere around sort of 15%. They thought, when we asked what they thought the poverty line was, they doubled it. They could not believe that 85% of people earned less than to get into the top rate of tax, which was then 40%, which meant earning about 40,000. They couldn't believe it, that the vast majority of the population were people they'd never met. And, of course, they then kept looking for reasons why the poor deserved their fate and why they merited theirs. And they would cling to anecdotes of people who'd made it against all the odds from rags to riches. You know, Alan Sugar, a name kept coming up. And when you tried to produce the statistics, they would always reply with anecdotes. They were Daily Mail through and through in their view of the world. You know, one good anecdote will outdo any number of statistics. So statistically, you know, looking at Gini coefficients, recessions show apparent lessening inequality, but I don't think anyone thinks that we're not on a long-term trajectory that widens the social divide. So at what point does it implode? I look forward to hearing your conclusion. I don't know. Most people of all political persuasions, if they look at graphs suggesting widening inequality, don't like it and are very alarmed by it. You know, even people on the right don't want it to get worse. Labour invested quite a lot in redistribution through tax credits mainly. Million fewer poor pensioners, million fewer poor children as a result. But that process is being put into reverse, as we shall probably see in next week's budget. And we're hearing that tax credits were a grave error, propping up low wages, but without a government instrument to enforce universal living wage, their living standards are likely to be cut again, as with housing benefit. The question is whether and for how long a majority of voters prefer to imagine themselves that somehow they're on the winning side of the widening divide, or whether at some point a majority feels this kind of unconstrained capitalism is doing them down. And we just had an election where Labour talked a lot about inequality, which it didn't much when in power. It did good by stealth. And in polling, their remedies, things like a mansion tax, banker's bonus tax, abolishing bedroom tax, were all very popular as individual items. In regular polls, some 80% of people keep saying that they think inequality in this country is too great, but Labour lost, partly because a government that has nothing but good-looking economic news in the months running up to an election, growth and jobs up, petrol prices and inflation down, is unlikely to be beaten. Most people's pay and living standards are still below pre-recession rates, but they opted for the hope that good news would eventually deliver for them too, and they still blamed Labour for the crash in the same way that just about every government in the world in power at the time of the crash got blamed and took the rap for it. It doesn't mean people approve of the direction capitalism's heading in, and in victory this government may yet overreach itself in hubris, presuming that people will accept that the rich should go on getting richer and the rest should be left further behind indefinitely. But if the future for their children in jobs and homes and life satisfaction, if it looks worse, not better than when they were young, then capitalism's promise will have failed. I was brought up in a generation where our post-war generation, we were post-war babies, just assumed that the progress that went all the way through from 1995 to the end of the 70s was an ineluctable and inevitable process of upward social mobility and general social improvement. I think that has been the culture, and it will take a while, I think, to sink in if that's no longer the case and things are apparently going into reverse for their children. So I very much look forward to hearing your solutions. Thank you.
I find your presentation completely compelling. In effect, the connection between the two challenge to capitalism is that the new wealth is going to be generated by the computers, which are going to put so many middle-class people out of work, is going to the few programmers and the kind of Bill Gates. And if the prediction are correct, is going to lead to further concentration of wealth rather than new distribution. We're going to hear next from Wolfgang Streeck, who, to make it short, is the ever more widely known as the young Max Weber. So.
Wow, yeah, good. Why not? Yeah, because what I'm trying to say is at the beginning very Weberian. We are rediscovering the historical nature of capitalism. It had a beginning, and now we're able to talk about its end. That is something that Talcott Parsons, in his reading of Max Weber, misunderstood. In the sort of sociology that I learned in the late 1960s and early 1970s, capitalism was basically the modern economy safely ensconced, safely contained in social integration. The books of the time even don't speak of capitalism anymore, or they think that it's the same as modernization, and modernization will go on forever, and there will be some discontents and cultural conflicts, but basically capitalism is here to stay. Now, suddenly, in the last few years, it is almost impossible not to talk about the impending end of capitalism. And there are very good reasons for this. I begin by quoting something that I found on the web. I've forgotten who wrote this, but it's sort of very, very interesting about the unfulfillable promises vested today in the financial system of advanced capitalism. I read, other distortions include never-ending growth, inconsequential externalities, universal abilities, perpetual productivity increases, inexhaustible demand, unquenchable consumption, the negation of chance, and the sustainability of mountains of debt. None of these are true in the real world, and yet they become the foundational assumptions of the financial structure. These distortions lead to undermining finance's credibility unless it is sustained only by the will of the majority not to face reality. I think that's a very nice description of what we're dealing with, and suddenly we're beginning to face reality. That all these good things will at some stage have to come to an end because the world is finite. I begin by saying something on what I call the system integration aspect of the crisis of capitalism, and then I'll say something on the social integration aspect. To those of you who are sociologists, I think the strange thing that we are experiencing now is that the disintegration begins at the system level, whereas at the social level, people sort of still try to cope, and they go to, on Black Friday, they go to shop like mad, and they use their credit cards, and they think that the bill will never be presented. So here we are. 3 long-term trends, and I fully agree with what Polly said. In fact, what I add to it is that it is not just the United Kingdom. We can locate these trends throughout the developed capitalist world. One is declining growth in a system that depends on growth. And that's a long-term trend. The second is rising inequality in a system that for its legitimacy requires that those who are supposed to work for the capital of others to be accumulated at least need some sort of compensation for doing so and for believing in the justness of the system. And the third is growing debt. And all of these trends you can sort of picture, they begin basically in the late 1970s. Let me say something on growth before I continue. I have these sort of numbers of things. Next will be 3 crises. But declining growth, when you mention declining growth, people say, the BRICS. The BRICS. At least they said that 4 years ago. The word basically is an invention by stock dealer based at where else? Goldman Sachs, who tried to sell all these, called them BRICS. Now, if you go through, Brazil is in a deep recession and beset with corruption all over the place that might bring down the government. Russia is a basket case. India is a place we know little about. Maybe it's still flourishing, but one hears other things about it. China is an interesting case. It seems to be indebted as much as the United States. And people talking about the risks of indebtedness now mention China as one other case. And finally, South Africa should never have been on that list in the first place. It was a salesman trick. Second, three trends, three crises, a sequence. Inflation in the 1970s, until used to paper over severe distributional conflicts, until it didn't serve the purpose anymore, disappeared. Comes public debt, 1980. Public debt you can sort of do for a while, and then you can't survive on it in the same way as inflation sort of becomes useless. Then comes private debt, 1980s. Private debt collapses in 2008, and we're now waiting for the collapse of the money that is being printed like mad under quantitative easing by our central banks. If you look at the statistics of the Bank for International Settlements, between 2007 and now, the holdings of the big central banks in the world have doubled. They are buying papers that the banks would rather get rid of. Doubled, yeah, and it's a continuous increase. Third, there's three what I call regime erosion processes on the borders of the capitalist system, where it borders to what Polanyi called the fictitious commodities of labor, land, and money. And in all these cases, the fact that now we're dealing with a global economy, whereas our regulatory capacities will for a long time be nested in national states, we see attacks on the systems that regulate the use of labor, the use of land, and the use of money. They are out of control. The working time is out of control. The invasion of privacy and private life through the labor market is out of control, and we have no means of regulating this. The climate, the climate situation is well known. The Pope has recently written. I recommend that you look at the encyclical, the last one. It is absolutely amazing. He uses the latest science, and he comes to the most amazing conclusions. Among them, the very strange idea that my former colleague in Germany, Ulrich Beck, had, that with the rise of the environmental crisis, class conflict would be gone. No, says the Pope, not at all. The first victims of the climate crisis are the poor. And the rich can sort of have lots of ways of extracting their fate and the fates of their families from what is going on in the destruction of the environment. We have the class conflict is coming back as an environmental conflict, says the Pope. So, to add to this, let me say that what I call the 5 disorders of modern capitalism. Secular stagnation. Now, I'm lucky here that I can quote this great connoisseur of modern capitalism, Larry Summers, who deregulated the American banking system in the 1990s as a Treasury Secretary, and 2 years ago spoke to his friends at the International Monetary Fund to tell them, look, friends, we're in trouble. There is something like secular stagnation. We may have to reckon with a decade or more of very low growth, and not only that, of all sorts of unpleasant things potentially happening on the way, like another crisis, or 2008, he says, could repeat itself any time. Very interesting sort of insight from someone who is one of the chief architects of the policy that exactly led to this situation. What does he recommend? I call him his friend Krugman, because basically they think along the same lines. A few days later, he writes, finally, Larry has seen the truth, the light, and now what do we do about it? Krugman counsels, don't over-regulate the financial sector, because we need growth. And if we do too much, then, of course, there might be some victims on the way, but that's better. And then he says, 5 years of useless investment are even better than 5 years without any investment. So let every American firm buy a Google Glass thing for each of their employees. They may be totally useless in terms of productivity, but at least we have demand. So here we see how the thing sort of hits the border to insanity. The second is oligarchic asset stripping, and that can't be overemphasized enough. These sort of 0.1% of families in our societies that are getting richer and richer. How many minutes? No minutes. Okay, then I just say oligarchic asset stripping, collapse of the public sphere, because it is being plundered by privatization and fiscal consolidation. Demoralization and cynicism is the fourth disorder, and international anarchy the fifth. And maybe I'm allowed to illustrate briefly the fourth disorder of modern capitalism. Soccer, football, right? Now wait, the thing is different from what you expect. There's this organization called FIFA. Yeah? They made roughly $5 billion in the last 5 years, of which we estimate that maybe 20%, $1 billion, was set aside for purposes of corruption. We're shocked. $1 billion for corruption. Now, banks. Right? Between 2008 and now, American banks paid fees, fines, settlement fees of $100 billion to the American justice system in order to escape trial and prosecution. This is 100 times as much as we suspect that this FIFA guy used for corruption. Yeah? But these firms pay the money because they are sure that adding lawyer fees, they would have to pay much more if it came actually to a trial, right? Okay, I just and this is our finest industry, the best and the brightest sort of work there. I was about to say something on what I think is going to be the future, but maybe I will have time later.
One reason I kept my German accent for the last 80 years, so at this point I can tell you, imitating Max Weber, you did well, my son. So. Now, you heard from Greg Calhoun, the director, but there's another one who is a distinguished social scientist and public intellectual, and he has the floor now.
Thank you very much, Amitai, for acknowledging that I have a split personality. presidents of universities always worry that any invitation comes only because of their position. So I'm grateful to David Marsden for insisting that this invitation became, because I actually published a book with the same title as this session. So does capitalism have a future? Of course it does. That doesn't mean it's necessarily pretty. Capitalism, we need to start by reminding ourselves, in line with what Wolfgang said and others, is more than just markets. The market fundamentalism of recent decades has, among other things, displaced from view the idea of capitalism with just the idea of markets, which may have a much wider spread. But capitalism has to do with specific organizations of economic activity that have built-in drives to expansion and accumulation and concentration of wealth, not just the market. Capitalism's, to be sure, not always the same. The capitalism we see in the world around us is shaped by the dramatic ascendancy of finance since the 1970s. It's financial capitalism, but the point is not just the labor. It's a capitalism which the proportion of activity is virtually reversed. In the 1970s, about a quarter of the wealth of the world was organized in financial assets. It's now about 3/4, even after the crisis. The expansion of corporations has changed capitalism. We often, when we rediscover that capitalism, not just markets, are at issue, go back to older economic theories, including Marx, which, among other things, don't have a strong account of corporations. But then also there is, in recent decades, the conversion of corporations themselves into commodities bought and sold, the creatures of mergers and acquisitions and sale, so that a powerful set of incentives to not providing pensions, not providing health care, and not providing security, even for those privileged enough to have relatively long-term employment in corporations, becomes a part of the feature of modern capitalism. There are variable roles for entrepreneurship, which may create opportunities in capitalism, may itself be important, but also may be squashed or may be degraded into what we see often, the ideology. Entrepreneurship is a possibility for creating the new and very important, but the idea gets degraded when we use it to describe everyone who is self-employed and potentially people who are extraordinarily vulnerable and in no realistic sense entrepreneurs, and beyond that to imply that it's their own fault if they end up completely unemployed because they simply should have been better entrepreneurs. And in capitalism, there are variable roles for states which may pursue similar ends of expansion and accumulation to corporations. In many ways, the USSR was a state capitalist society doing that, but which may also work in very different ways to provide enabling conditions and to organize capitalism to an extent. So capitalism varies. It's not just a single thing. And it works more or less, certainly not as well as we might wish, and often in ways that are problematic. But it needs to be said that in varying degrees it works, and it need not reach an end at any specific point. So to say, which I think is true, that capitalism is a humanly created historical system, and therefore it will change or very likely end or at least transform beyond recognition, is important. We need to remind ourselves, Polly said something of this, it's not just nature. It's not something we should just take for granted as the only way things could be. Tina, there is no alternative, is one of the most pernicious ideas that has been articulated. But it's not so easy to find the alternative, and we shouldn't wish away the reality of capitalism and working, nor should we denigrate those who in various ways try to work to make a more humane system within this framework. My own bet in this context is on change beyond recognition. That is neither a sort of terminal end in crisis, nor a continuation of just what the world saw, say, during Les Trente Glorieuses, during the post-war boom and the sort of heyday of global capitalism. How fast and what change is subject to historical struggle and vicissitudes. Among the various things, I think is likely, is a separation of the widespread notion that capitalism and democracy go together, and an increased recognition that they don't have to go together. That statist capitalism may be very different from liberal capitalism, that liberal capitalism, as it flourished and was idealized in the West in the post-war era, may vanish without capitalism vanishing. Capitalism is good, it needs to be said, at some things. It's not good at others, and it's actively bad at still more. It is good at wealth creation, and it's important to note that, as indeed Marx famously noted it. And this is why less developed countries around the world are betting on capitalism in large degree, why there is a large scale of uptake for capitalism as a project of wealth creation, why it is a problem for those worried about climate change who would like to advocate zero growth. It is still a powerful machine for wealth creation. Capitalism is very bad at distribution. We've had many comments on this. The problems of inequality are real. So equitable distribution of any kind is not to be expected, but distribution in general, even inequitable distribution, is a problem, particularly in finance capitalism. Full employment policies can mitigate this, and there have been various periods. Keynesian full employment policies were advocated, but also industrial capitalism created more of a push towards high employment redistribution and gave more of an edge to workers organizing in trade unions than the kind of capitalism we've seen recently. It also needs to be said, though, that capitalism is not just productive of wealth, it's productive of ilth, bad stuff. Ilth is a term from John Ruskin, a great 19th century English thinker, who pointed out that we constantly measure the production of wealth and celebrate the production of wealth and forget the production of ilth, of pollution, say, among the many, many kinds of ilth that are produced, the negative externalities, if you will. And capitalism is nothing if not a machine for the production of externalities, some positive, many negative. So what challenges capitalism now? First, systemic risk. Wolfgang alluded to the same thing under systemic integration points. I don't think that we should think the crisis of Greece will be enough, nor was the whole financial crisis of the last several years enough to produce this. But systemic risk is real, and it does produce something the closest thing to a potential for actual collapse in capitalism. Problems with the way the global financial system in particular are organized. Financialization has not stopped. An interesting thing about the crisis is that it didn't reverse financialization. In 2009, many thought it would, or at least that there would be a major movement of new global financial regulation that would provide new conditions to stabilize it as the Bretton Woods institutions had before the 1970s. But this didn't happen. Financialization continues. Wolfgang repeated some of the statistics, and the architecture remains very shaky and problematic. So this is a continuing issue. Risk changes in its forms, of course. Financial engineering is all about risk management, but as we've seen, sometimes concentrates the risk in certain places in the system. It was proposed as a solution. It hasn't been a solution. And there's also been the phenomenon of turning private financial risk, private banking problems into public. In Europe in particular, a major feature of the financial crisis was that European states solved the problems of the private financial sector by turning them into public financial problems, by nationalizing them in various ways. Not nationalizing the banks, nationalizing the toxic debt. And this has made the crisis in Europe increasingly a political crisis as well as an economic or financial crisis. I won't go into it, but it's also important to say that capitalism is challenged from within, if you will, by unofficial or illegal capitalism, by the enormous and growing scale of not just organized crime or outright criminality, but of an off-the-books capitalism, which means a capitalism not taxed and therefore not providing resources to states for any kind of compensatory action to deal with some of the ilth or the failures of distribution of capitalism. So the trillions and trillions of euros that are in illicit enterprise of various kinds, extending into things like trafficking of human beings or of guns or of drugs, but not just in those firmly illegal enterprises, but in simply evading the state and the movements of money are big issues. I think there are three major issues that need to be stated. One is as the potential things that could either end capitalism or transform it beyond recognition. One is the destruction of the political and social conditions for capitalism. Here I'm in agreement with Wolfgang that there are problems. We could think of it as a legitimation problem, a legitimation crisis here. But there are institutional deficits. The weakening of welfare states is the obvious form, but as I stressed, private corporations have been weakened in terms of their capacity to provide the same sort of welfare benefits to their members. So the institutional deficits are not just the crisis of the welfare state, but of institutions in a much broader sense. Unemployment, inequality, or the end of growth all could potentially end social solidarity or even acquiescence in the system. So it is possible. I would suggest that there is, and in a way Wolfgang's reference to a social integration issue, by and large, people have worked very hard to try to sustain some level of social integration, and this is one of the reasons that there is still an acceptance, if not a happiness, about the existing system. So if unemployment, inequality, the end of growth make you think, oh, well, the silver lining is revolution, I would suggest faith in revolution is probably misplaced. One of the distinctive features of the recent financial crisis has been the near absence of anti-systemic movements for truly transcending capitalism and replacing it by some alternative scalable economic system. There have been anarchist responses in terms of neighborhoods or districts of cities and alternative money systems and barter and trade, but not a scalable alternative to the capitalist system. There have been populist movements that, like Syriza and Podemos, but also on the far right, but they challenge for political power. They don't offer a real alternative to capitalism. There have been occupations of many public places, not just Occupy Wall Street, but in various European squares and plazas, but virtually devoid of a systemic alternative and especially a scalable one. This is the first major world crisis in 150 years in which socialism has not figured even a little bit as a significant alternative. A second class of problems, and David hasn't held up, but will shortly hold up the zero sign, so I know it's coming. I'll just state the destruction of the geopolitical conditions for capitalism, war, conflict. We are in a world full of significant and sometimes small wars that are increasingly interconnected and interconnected in part through the capitalist system and through markets, not just markets for weapons, but oil and other things. And the potential for these to interconnect into a really deeply damaging war is there. Third is the destruction of the conditions for human life itself. Climate change, for example, also disease. The extent to which climate change is linked to those externalities of capitalism. The ill that is created is real. The addiction to growth makes it all but impossible to respond effectively to climate change. Within a capitalist framework, we say, well, green growth will do the job. We can be more optimistic about that or less, but there is a major risk to the very ability to sustain capitalism, but not because it will hit capitalism per se, because we won't exist, and therefore capitalism won't if there is sufficiently radical climate change. Well, what else could happen? So collapse may or may not happen. A very likely possibility is indefinite continued intensification of capitalism. That is the continued pursuit of growth in a capitalist framework that will produce more and more illth, more and more negative externalities, potentially disastrous consequences. I think betting on something like that makes more sense than betting on collapse, unfortunately, if you're just placing the odds, or fortunately. And I'm going to say, actually, fortunately, strangely enough, since I'm hardly happy about it. Also possible is transformation and pluralization. That is, a world in which capitalism stops being the dominant global organization but becomes part of a more complex mix of ways of organizing economic life and global interconnection, with other systems also vying for attention and other ways of doing things, including resurgent social democracy and so forth. Some level of compensatory action. Polanyi's idea of a double movement is still possible. And I'm a reformist in my old age enough to say I would rather bet on trying to restore some levels of social protection and solidarity and some compensatory movement than bet on the outright revolution. What seems very unlikely to me in closing is a pure collapse of capitalism on the one hand, or a revolutionary transformation on the other, creating socialism or indeed any other new system without a prolonged period of ambiguity, difficulty, and conflict. In other words, the end of capitalism may be much more like the end of the Roman Empire or the end of feudalism than it is like the end of Ancien Regime France or the end of the Soviet Union. The idea that it will end all at once and we can look and say it was January 23rd of 2018 is very unlikely. 200 or 300 years of extremely difficult conditions is much more likely.
Yeah.
Your text provides the perfect framing for our second round, and I know many of you cannot wait anymore for my answer to what is going to replace capitalism. So here it comes with a combination of Karl Marx and Abraham Maslow. The young Marx had this idea that we're going to work 2 hours a day, fish 2 hours, and we do 2 hours filing. He thought filing is all you need for politics. But basically, the idea was that our life would not be centered around work, but around other pursuits. Maslow has a very important insight in the hierarchy of human needs. Unlike the counterculture, he realizes that we do first have to secure that everybody will get strong and complete secure satisfaction of basic human needs. The problem arises only when we use consumer goods and materialism to try to satisfy the higher needs, which are gaining respect of each other, love, and ultimately self-expression, self-actualization. So in my terminology, consumption turns an obsession into consumerism when we tell her, diamonds are a girl's best friends. They don't hug you very well. And so the question is, what would a society look like in which its central project would not be to produce ever more material goods and work ever longer and harder hours in order to buy things we don't really need, and we need ever more spending on advertising to convince us to buy things we don't need. Now, since this involves an enormous leap of imagination, let me just remind that the idea that hard work and excessive consumption is what life is all about, that's the definition of the good life, is a very new idea. The Chinese thought that the most distinguished, respectful thing to do was brush painting, philosophy, and poetry. The Jewish community thought that studying the Talmud was the most important thing. And of course, in these parts, the contempt for commerce and labor was fairly intense in early years. Now, what I should not try to overlook for a second, in earlier eras, these good lives were given to a small layer of society, and the rest of society was made to work so some people could have that non-commercial good life. In the Jewish community, the women were supposed to work so the men could go and study. Well, that's not exactly what Marx or Maslow envisioned. The idea is that this time, everybody will have to be cut in. And that would require people finding contentment in other pursuits than buying the most recent tie or the most recent handbag and throwing out the good towels because Martha Stewart says this year you have to have polka dots on them, and those with lines are no longer usable. And so basically, and again, in that sense, Marx anticipated and Maslow explicated, there are three areas in which we can see people flourishing without being required to work long hours for jobs which, as I suggested earlier, no longer going to exist, and finding other sources of contentment once their basic needs are satisfied. And one is lasting, meaningful relationships. And there are mountains of data which show that people who are in lasting, meaningful relationships live longer, healthier, happier lives. Longer, happier, healthier lives. That's not a small claim. I don't know that many capitalist projects can promise you a longer, healthier, happier life. So that we can see there's some forerunners of this. There are millions of Americans who retire before they have to, so they're not being fired, they have not lost their job. But in effect, they make a choice of having less income by definition because they retired early, because they want to spend the rest of their life with their grandchildren, with their friends, playing basketball or domino, and they find contentment in their pursuit. Second pursuit is spiritual, intellectual, such. I know I'm not going to win a lot of points for that, but I also have to live up by my sociological standards. A lot of people find a lot of comfort in praying or other spiritual pursuits, if it's yoga or contemplation or what, or meditation. And again, the data is unmistakable. People who spend more of their life in these kind of self-expressions live longer, check on me, healthier, happier lives than those who try to get the most recent car or whatever, the most recent gadget. I just digress here for 30 seconds. I recently gave a TED talk at Oxford. It is important for my story. In order to attend a TED talk, you have to pay $6,000. So there were not many poor people in the room. And so I started by saying, do you need inflatable Santa Clauses on your rooftop, which many Americans feel they do? And I got a nice little chuckle. And then I said, do you need plastic pelicans on your front lawn? And there wasn't great demand for that. And then I said, do you need flat TV? And flat TV. And the chuckling stopped. And then I said, how about an F6 phone? And they asked me to leave. What I'm trying to illustrate, we do have an addiction, and if we are able to buy out of that notion, that we are measured by what we can buy beyond what we really need, we'll liberate ourselves for the other pursuit. And the third one is, of course, political action. Political action is what is necessary, and I very much agree with Craig Calhoun. Recently, so much of young people and others withdraw from politics, and we will not get the newly structured societies without such a change. Now, but the good news, the really good news is that if you for a moment envision a society a la Marx, in which we earn enough for our basic needs by working a shorter day and spend the rest of the day with our children and grandchildren and friends, enjoying the sunsets, and going to a union meeting. I need to do something for you.
What do you need the union for, then?
To have a place to spend the afternoon. The point is that we need political action to be able to get a society allowed. But the good news is that this society I envision has two other attributes. One is very obvious and one is not at all. The obvious one is it's environmentally friendly. Because